Welcome to the LDA podcast, a series by the Learning Disabilities Association of America. Our podcast is dedicated to exploring topics of interest to educators, individuals with learning disabilities, parents, and professionals to work towards our goal of creating a more equitable world. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the LDA podcast. We're here today with Denise Brodey. She's a senior contributor to Forbes, founder of Rebel Talent, author of The Elephant in the Playroom, and winner of the 2023 Harrison Sylvester Award. Denise, thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for the award. It's so meaningful to me because I have, watched LDA and used your resources for so long as a mom, and then became, much more of an adult advocate for adults and young adults. So I've watched your growth, and I'm just thrilled.
Oh yeah, we're really proud to be able to honor you with that. And thank you so much for all of your work that helps to serve adults with learning disabilities and ADHD. So to expand on that, would you be able to share some of your background with us, who you are, what you do?
Sure. So first of all, I'm a journalist at heart. I grew up running to the mailbox, that's how old I am, to get magazines like Glamour and Self and the latest copy of, believe it or not, Newsweek or Time, and those were discussed at the dinner table. And so I always wanted to be a magazine editor, and I was for 25 years. So I went to college, and the first thing I did after college was join a national women's magazine, and it was love at first sight, lots and lots and lots of hard work, but I find that storytelling and connecting with people and understanding science, I'm mainly a health, medical, and now business reporter. So I write for Forbes, and I am an author of a book called The Elephant in the Playroom. And that was all about storytelling of 41 families. And after that experience, I really understood, not only from a personal perspective with my son, who was diagnosed with learning differences and childhood depression as a 5 to 7 year old-ish, I'd say, it's hard to diagnose. I really understood the value of hearing other people's stories. And that's where the words "the elephant in the playroom" came from, because I always wanted to talk about what nobody was talking about. And that's a lot. So storyteller at heart, I would say. And I'm now working on a second book, which is The Elephant in the Office, and that'll come out next year. It's very similar. I watched the growth of my son's generation and my daughter's generation, millennials and Gen Z, and how incredibly proud and forward-thinking they are of being different. And so this book addresses that directly from their point of view, which I think is really important for businesses to understand.
Yeah, we'll definitely be looking for that one to come out. So you had mentioned that you like to report on the stories that aren't always told, or the topics that aren't always talked about. So when did you decide to become an advocate for individuals with ADHD or learning disabilities?
I didn't ever think of myself as somebody with learning disabilities, even though I had so many, which is nuts. I grew up in a family of 2 therapists. Both will tell you, whoops, we missed those. We didn't notice Denise as having some issues. I was a girl in the 80s, and like so many women today are finding out, well, if you were quiet and you got good grades and you were generally what they would call compliant and you weren't getting into a huge amount of trouble, that was your way of advocating for yourself, was to just be quiet, take up not too much space, and do the best you could, right? And then I had family, I had my own family, and I watched my son really struggle with noise sensitivity and anxiety, and I started to look at him and think, that's me. He's doing all of the things that I did, and I get it. And that's when I became an advocate for younger people and moms understanding what's going on, so that there wasn't this silly conference call over bad behavior or not handing in homework. It was, how do we get to the root of this problem that is not necessarily my son, right, or my daughter or his classmates. It may be you, the teacher, or it may be me, the parent, and we have to figure out how to be advocates for him because he's too small to do it for himself. And so those were the early days of saying, I have to take this into my own hands, because I saw how different he was in different atmospheres. When he felt comfortable, he was amazing, and articulate and interested and curious and so much fun and such a sweet person. And when he was anxious or things made him nervous or things were too loud, just like me as a kid, he clammed up and nobody got to know him. And that was so similar to me. So, I went along this route of learning about other parents and sort of chasing after them, saying, so excuse me, but what do you do about medication? Or, so excuse me, would you mind sitting with me at Starbucks? And that was my, mini forays into just like grabbing people here and there. And as a reporter, I was a good listener to people's advice, and then I would go online and research the heck out of it, right? So my advocacy really comes from my son, but also then recognizing myself in him and saying, hold on a second, there was nobody talking about learning disabilities in women. There was no one talking about ADHD in women. And when I say nobody, maybe behind closed doors, there was a lot of conversation about depression and anxiety and dyslexia maybe, but the combination of LD and ADHD and sensory issues, those were not on the menu that I had anyway, right? So I began to advocate for people to just talk openly about their diagnosis. And then, this is sort of a long-ish story, but basically I got to where I am now, which is it's everybody's choice as to where they want to be talking about their learning disability and their attention issues and their anxiety and their mental health. But as long as they can somehow put words to it and figure out how to advocate for themselves using their own non-medical terms, that's where I am now. That's my sort of very long journey towards, be yourself and learn how to advocate whatever way you can.
Right. So many people have your same journey of being a personal advocate, either for yourself or their child, and then realizing that they don't want anybody else to have to go through all the research and things that they went through. So it's amazing that there's so many parents out there who, once they're done advocating for their children, they go forward and, make sure everybody else has these resources.
Yeah, and that's a big change. That's a big change in, I'd say, the last 5 years. That people have said, I can't watch this happen anymore. Mm-hmm. I think they had their own journey where they felt sort of demeaned or not as successful as they possibly could, and they took it upon themselves to get more training. That's new, and it's a really exciting place.
Yeah, definitely. So could you tell us a little bit about Rebel Talent, how you came to found it?
Sure. So one of the things that I did as a writer was say, how do I write for the business world? And how do I talk to business people? Because mostly they were talking about compliance or legal issues with the ADA. And I queried Forbes and I said, I'd like to talk about people with learning disabilities who are really not recognized and spoken about in the third person in the business world. And I said, they're talented, but they're also rebellious. And then I said, they're rebel talent, of course. And the woman on the other end of the phone, the editor, was like, I don't really know if this is going to work. And I said, okay, well, why don't we just go with, I write about disability and inclusion for the business world, and that I want to speak in a first person voice. And so that's really where I started. I said, let's see what will fly. And I became the first contributor at Forbes to write about disability and inclusion from a very personal point of view, and constantly not using press releases or medical experts necessarily, but to go do a 180 and talk to the people who were in businesses who were secretly making their way successfully up the ladder, or HR people who secretly knew this is what's going on. And so I felt like all of those people were extremely talented and rebellious, and I wanted first to write about them. And then I said, it's not enough to write about them. I'm getting letters saying, how can I do this at my company? How can I create connections and conversations? And my first thought was, well, let me research where that's being done. And there were very few places that was actually being done. And that's when I said, there's a need for rebel talent. There's a need for ERGs, employee resource groups, for affinity groups, for HR groups, for basically any kind of group that was talking on Facebook, to have those conversations in businesses and among leaders. And I was struck by the idea that only 2 to 3% of people from an EY study revealed, even in leadership circles, revealed their disabilities, physical or non-physical. So that meant that while we all lauded Richard Branson or Charles Schwab, where were the women? There weren't any in leadership circles. Where were the people with mental health concerns and learning disabilities? They must have been, they're pretty quiet, right? And that's where the idea of let's infiltrate, and probably right around when the pandemic started, I had just started saying, let's have these conversations. And it worked out really, sadly, perfectly timed, because when people start talking about their mental health, they also bring up different issues with struggling with focus and brain fog and menopause. And so it was a natural opening for me to say, I will put together focus groups for you. I will create impact reports for you. I will do the research within your company to make it a business priority. And that's what Rebel Talent does. But despite all the data out there, it really, what Rebel Talent comes down to is conversations and connections. And it's interpersonal. Research shows you learn the most when you meet and talk face to face with someone who is an ally, an advocate, will admit to some of their issues, may have even come out and disclose that they have dyslexia or ADHD, but they don't necessarily have to. They simply have to enter the conversation with someone who doesn't know anyone like them, and it turns things around. So that's what we did.
Amazing. So just sort of turning that kind of culture of things that are taboo, or, you know, that can even be harmful to disclose in a workplace, into something that's a little more of an everyday conversation and something to embrace.
Right. I even recently have said, let's not talk about mental health. Let's not talk about even the specific labels of dyslexia or dysgraphia or whatever, or autism. Let's talk about people trying to do their best work, reaching the goals that you want them to reach, how you support them, what are the mechanics of the team and the team dynamics? How does the leader adjust and become more flexible? And how do you meet in the middle? If you notice, none of those things talk about accommodations, right? It's simply goal setting. And that's what managers are supposed to be doing in the first place. And that's what business leaders want, is to reach goals. So it's so obvious that it doesn't happen, right? People think, oh, I've got to deal with this, I've got to have this secret group with this outing or an icebreaker every morning. How's your mental health? And I think to myself, no, just like, how's it going? Does your phone work? Is anyone in your house sick? Do you think we're going to make this goal? Why not? How can I help you? Those are, what my favorite pumpkin pie recipe is. And, the stress of my in-laws, those are those classic icebreakers, right? Like, what's everyone making today or whatever during the pandemic, those kinds of things. And I'm thinking to myself, all of that is really the same as talking about mental health. And all of that leads us to, how do I reach my goals, and how do I maintain my focus, my sleep, my working memory for all that's going on under such stress? How do I talk about my stress? How do I manage people who bother me at work because I have quirks and they have quirks? How do I manage difficult conversations? Again, all of that is allowing for conversations about being a rebel talent or being an advocate for yourself, but it doesn't include a lot of terminology. And that's really where I've ended up post-pandemic. And I think a lot of people are with me.
Just sounds like a really human approach.
Yeah, I also get to interview so many people who give me examples of things where they said, and I'm sure coaches feel this way too, where they said, so I went into my boss after I talked to you and I just wrote down the 10 ways I work best. And I said, could you write down how you work best? And it seemed really awkward, but they did it. And now we're doing great.
Yeah.
So I think it can be so obvious to skip over the human part of it. But the other part that I also see is people have a sense of humor. And when you start talking like a person, you can laugh about the things that happen. Mm-hmm. And your boss isn't so uptight and has, has something funny to say. And so I have the benefit of hearing all the positive stories and the human, the things that people do that actually work, because that's how I write and that's the way I approach my business. And I'm hoping that just rubs off on the world.
Yeah, definitely. Well, to touch on that a little bit more too, you had said that you were getting some letters from people asking for help in their workspaces. Are there some common challenges that you sort of saw over and over again that people were facing in the workplace?
Yeah. I get calls from people who want me to also do big data business analytics, right? Or go through pages and pages of spreadsheets, like I did for the Valuable 500, which is a group of Fortune 500 companies that have come together to stop exclusion, right? And even with those big data sets and everything else, what it came down to was, have you said anything? Avoidance is a really big issue. People will avoid saying things, they'll talk around them. And I say, have you straight up said, what if I just didn't have meetings before 9 a.m.? So that came out or what if the other one is lack of collaboration. This came up a lot in the Valuable 500 and other places I work in business. There are people in your business who aren't talking to their competitors or other people who are, let's say, creative directors or line managers, if all those people spoke together and collaborated within a company, even just once a quarter, they would learn so much about each other and problem solving. So again, it was this finding resources wasn't so much about some outside consultant. The answers were there from people working in other departments, but the cross collaboration, the cross pollination, someone's, will write me and say, well, how do you do that? And again, it's the same. I mean, it sounds so silly, but is you ask.
Yeah.
You say, would your department like to have an informal lunch with my department as we welcome people back to the office? This is a time of serious change. And so that brings me to my final point. There's avoidance, there's lack of collaboration, but also there's lack of flexibility, and people lean a lot on transparency, or we're very transparent here. And we like to make sure everyone is is understood that they have the resources. Right. But what if you were, again, to sort of not avoid things, collaborate, and then give people the ability to talk in any terms that they needed to get the resources they need. But it's really like, it's connecting, it's collaborating. And then I'm trying to think of the best word for it is over communicating. Is maybe you asked once, but you didn't ask a second or a third time.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the biggest problems, and they're very human problems, and they don't revolve around technology or anything else.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in addition to your work with Rebel Talent, you're also a senior contributor to Forbes. So you touched on that a little bit. You write about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So could you speak on why it's so important to have neurodiverse voices in media?
Yeah, the amount of difference in people and how little it shows up in media is astounding. And my number one job is to say, okay, I need people of all ages. I need people of different colors. I need people with different levels of experience. I need people from different fields, because the media is so much more trustworthy when we're not spouting something that comes from, a government statistic or a big press release. When the real voices come out and there's a nuanced report, it may take 4 or 5 stories to get people to buy into what you're saying or to understand that this is a complex issue. But in a clickbaity world, the more, even if you have, 10 ways to talk about your neurodiversity, right? If you're only looking at that world after that headline from the point of view of one voice, someone who may not even understand neurodiversity, and they're calling an expert, that's not going to get you very far. It's just, you're spinning your wheels. For the American public to hear real stories, that's and to have the depth of knowledge to call out someone in an interview and go, hold on a second, really? Or to take all the knowledge that they have accumulated and match it up with the research. That's a depth of understanding that neurodivergent people bring to the world that is so valuable. It's just we're making so much more progress every single time people tap into different kinds of minds, all kinds of minds. And the great thing is that it's out there, the good and the bad is that it's out there forever. So anyone can find it. And even though some of the lines maybe, made for businesses and big websites. I think, and I've seen, that the good stories get passed around and they make their way into the universe in a different way when there are different voices in them.
Because it reaches a wider audience, like the audience is there.
Yeah, and the audience trusts people.
Mm-hmm.
And not to toot my own horn, but I've had people call me and say, I want you to write this story because you got it. You got it when you wrote about Best Buy, or you got it when you wrote about Microsoft, and you said, well, they have a 7%, 7% rule, which is basically 7% of their company has a disability, right? And they basically said, but that's not good enough, right? And I was the reporter among many others who said that the mainstream media might have just said, so there's a 7%, people try for 7% disability inclusion. But what we said was, they know that's not good enough, and here's all the cool ways they're doing more. So that's a very specific example of getting trust, because people who follow the news know that neurodivergent people are underemployed. And even when you say, wow, employment has risen so much for neurodivergent people, it's still really, really bad. There's way too many people who are not employed. And that's why it's so important to put that context, to build that trust, so that that's just how we move forward in this country,
Yeah.
So.
Well, moving forward in this country kind of leads into my next question. You had written a 70-page report on progress in global business disability inclusion. So I was just curious, from your perspective, do you believe that there'll be more of an effort in disability inclusion in the workplace in the next few years? And if so, what does this mean for adults with ADHD and LD?
I think there's an openness right now, and we need to take advantage of that openness. It doesn't come with a guarantee that things are going to change, because honestly, the people in charge are still the same people. So if you don't have diverse people at the top, you have to really be forward thinking about, how are we going to take this moment when everything is in flux and take advantage of it? And I feel really positive about the opportunity, but I caution that we can't squander it, and I caution that everyone not think that leadership starts the ball rolling. That it seems to me change starts in the middle, and change starts at the bottom, and protests and unions and efforts to say, I don't like this hiring process, the growth of gig workers and entrepreneurship, all of those things will play a role in changing rules. So will generations who won't put up with sacrificing their entire lives for their jobs. So it's going to be a group effort, and it's not going to come from the top. I'm wary of that description. I really am. I encourage anyone to take part in any way that they can in change, and know that whether they're advocating or passing on LDA resources, or simply opting out of the workforce because they're too stressed because they're neurodivergent and they're raising neurodivergent children, to say, whatever I do, my small part in the middle or the bottom is setting an example that I need to take care of myself first, that it's not all about leadership and what leadership goals are. It's again, back to the human thing. I have a friend who I haven't spoken to in a million years. It's a good example. And she wrote that she took 3 months off from her job. On LinkedIn, she wrote this, and that she would begin looking for a new job once her son was back, or I think it was her son or daughter, was back, really feeling better, and that she'd really struggled with leaving her job, and she was putting it out there, full disclosure that soon she would need a new job, and this is why she left. And it was just brilliant, and it got passed around everywhere, and I see those every day on LinkedIn. And that's not, she's somewhere in the middle. I mean, she's, I wouldn't say she's the top of the pile, but I wouldn't say she's an entry-level person whatsoever. And so for her as a manager and as someone who had to manage up, to write that all on LinkedIn, that's a beautiful example of one person makes a huge difference. And she was sitting right in the middle of a very messy middle, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can throw as much data as you want at the world. You can, try and change legislation, and there are great people doing that. But that's also a bit of a privilege to be able to do that. And so if you don't have the privilege to opt out of a job, or you don't have the privilege of having someone else to help you find the best therapist or whatever it is, at least sharing that knowledge with your peers and peer advocacy, which is a whole nother discussion. I think that will be changing the world a lot.
Definitely. I like how, it's not set in stone. It's something that we have to work for. So I really like that message.
Yeah. I mean, no, you just can't take it for granted.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't take anything for granted. I think mostly I've learned that through the pandemic, but also by watching my kids and knowing that they lived through, they went to college, they worked their butts off, and they came out the other side and everything had changed. So they're 24 and 26. So they're living it. And I watched that generation. I would just add one last thing is the way we really can create change in the future with these terrible unemployment numbers and the lack of sort of understanding for accommodations and those kinds of things, is to listen to younger generations, is to make this an intergenerational issue.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and is there anything else that you wanted to touch on that maybe I didn't ask?
Not really. I mean, I hope I didn't sound too negative. I think I'm trying to come from a place of learned helpfulness,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really good perspective. And I mean, obviously a lot of learned experience too that has helped to shape that. So
right. Yeah. I mean, I call it learned helpfulness because obviously Martin Seligman was, learned helplessness. That's what ruled, right? Like if you had learned to, everyone learned, oh, I'm too codependent, I'm this. It's like, okay, let's just change the conversation to learned helpfulness. If we could all do that, we'd be better off. And people who are ADHD they love helping people. It's one of their traits. It's what they can do. They love researching things. They love helping people. They're very empathic, and they know a workaround like nobody's business. So, learned helpfulness.
Definitely, I like that. So, Denise, where can people find your work and connect with you or follow you?
Sure. I'm reluctantly on Twitter at D Brodey. I am definitely at elephants-everywhere.com. And that's where you can sign up to get a newsletter. You can read my blog. You can find my Forbes stories and my other stories that I write. You can, if you're a business, you can find some of the business case studies and the people that I work with. And in the future, you'll be able to find a lot of downloads and a lot of one sheets that help other people at that mid-level who are sort of, I'm really focused on managers and managers talking about the elephant in the room or the elephant in the office.
Definitely. That sounds great.
Oh, sorry. And I've said this since I wrote my first book, but if you put elephant in the subject line of your email to me on LinkedIn or anywhere, I know that you've heard this podcast or you've heard me talk about elephants and that you have an issue that you really just don't know where else to turn. And I'm happy to find you a resource.
That's fantastic. Well, Denise, thank you so much for being on this podcast. And again, congratulations on the 2023 Harrison Sylvester Award. It's definitely well deserved.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was great talking to you, and I can't wait to meet you.
Thank you for listening to the LDA podcast. To learn more about LDA and to get valuable resources and support, visit ldaamerica.org.